I'm Sarah Leach.
I'm Danny Brewer.
And we have James Demps behind the camera.
Hi.
This is my grandfather, Ken Brewer,
Yes.
and he was in the Navy during the Vietnam War in the submarines.
Right.
Would you like to talk about your role in the submarines?
Yeah, I was a radioman. So on the submarine, I kept the contact within the submarine. And then when I was in base, which was most of the time, because we only had short tours because of the stress of being underwater for long periods of time. So I was a corpsman on the base and worked out of the hospital. So that was kind of my role, at that time. And so let's kind of just take it from there and just whatever you can think to ask.
All right. So what was your stance on U.S.'s entry into the Vietnam War, just as a whole?
Well, the whole perspective's so much different than today, and I know you're probably going to ask some things later on about foreign policy and things like that, or how it's developed or whatever. But the thing is, times were so different than today. First of all, we didn't have the internet. We didn't have media was not as communicative on things that were happening because the government was looked at with a lot more, in my opinion, respect and fear than it is now. So the thing was, we knew not too much about the war other than it was a time that the draft was enacted. And that meant anybody of, I believe it was 17 years old and up to 30 was eligible for the draft, and there were only a couple of exemptions that were from that. I didn't qualify for any of them fast enough when we were notified, and so many of us just graduated from high school and immediately had to go into military service. So we had that disruption in the whole country at that time, especially, and we were the baby boomers. So and even today, there's more baby boomers per group, X generation and whatever generation you were born in. Baby boomers still outnumber any other generation. So we had a big influence as young people in the day, and young people have a tendency, and I myself had a tendency to look at things a little less from the standpoint of real depth of knowledge in what was going on in the country, and then we really didn't have the opportunity to be able to do it back then. And we came into this whole situation kind of blind, and we thought any day now America was going to get run over by communists, and somehow Russia must have been involved with Vietnam, and we had to try to find a way to protect our country from being invaded from communist forces. And it was a totally different time. It was the same era that really television became a platform for even presidential debates and so forth. It was the first ones. Nixon and Kennedy, from what I can remember, maybe I'm wrong on this, but Nixon and Kennedy were the first ones, especially Kennedy, to actually use television to promote their campaign. And it was also the same time that in that same time frame of that decade, it was a time when I believe it was Johnson was the one really that got us involved in the war. And he's also the one that later on signed the Civil Rights Act. So you had all of these dynamics going on at the same time. You had social and civil unrest with the war that was going on, and young people being forced into doing something that most of them didn't want to do. And it wasn't a matter of enlisting in the military, it was a matter of you had to go in the military. And we had seen some of our friends come back and they were injured or they were wounded or missing limbs and so forth. Usually back in that era, the reason we had such a high casualty of over 50,000 was because we didn't have the body armor or the techniques that we have now for warfare. And very few people were wounded and lived through it. So we had many friends that came back. They were either mentally messed up so that they weren't functional anymore in society, or many many of them came back in coffins. So we saw this whole thing, and we thought, why do we want to die for something we don't even understand? And at least this is how I felt, and most of the friends I hung around with. And the ones that seemed to be able to prosper during that time in the military were those that went into it with a purpose in mind right from the beginning, and went through high school knowing that this is what they wanted to do. So you had two different things going on at once. Then you had the college age kids that became politically unrested, and you had the hippie movement going at the same time. We're dropping out of society, and we all kind of at that age had a feeling that once you were 30 years old, you couldn't be trusted anymore. So that's kind of the climate. That's a long one, and I'm not going to spend as much time on the other things
Alright,
as
no
that, but just to
problem.
kind of
I
set
love
the
it.
stage, you know, on what was going on at the time.
Okay. So you mentioned that, you know, you were seeing your friends or people were seeing their peers come back injured and mentally disturbed from
Right.
serving. So do you have a distinctive worst memory or worst time throughout the entire war?
Of what happened within the war itself, or me personally, or?
Just anything that stands out that really bothered you.
Well, one of the things that really bothered me was, you know, in recent decades, we've had a big war on drugs and, you know, importing of drugs and so forth. I believe back in those days, and I knew it even on our submarine base, many of the guys that would come back from Vietnam had become heroin addicts because it was so easily obtainable there. And at that point, marijuana was everywhere when we were in that decade. It was a decade of, like I said, hippies and free love and you know, rebellion. And the thing was, many of my friends smoked marijuana, and yet very few did heroin. So to me, that really stood out to see that this thing, I mean, even at my young age of like 18 years old, I could see what this could develop into. And it was not only a war that people were dying, you know, classmates and friends and people that maybe I didn't know but were out of my age group that were dying, not really understanding why. But not only that, but also the fear that here comes this invasion of drugs, and it's absolutely going to have such an impact. And I worked at the hospital. I saw many kids come in from the base. Really, they were kids, and they had overdosed and died on the base because of drug abuse, you know, with heroin. So that was the thing that stood out the most for me, and a few other friends that I was very close to that went into the war and came back because of extreme mental trauma. You know, one had. You can just stop for a moment.
I was going to ask you a question.
Okay.
Sure.
Okay, so you said that you were 17, 18, and that
Right.
that your opinion of the war was that
Right.
it was just kind of, you didn't know what you were getting into. So do you feel like people who were older had a different opinion of the war?
It depended on what group how can I put it, what type of background they came from.
Oh, okay.
If they were more on the, you know, their family was military, and there was a lot of military families in our country back in those days,
Mm-hmm.
because we had the Korean War, we had
Yeah.
the World War II, you know, they were our either parents or grandparents. Really our parents, they all came out of World War II, so they were gun-ho. So you had the gun-ho people, and then you had the other group that was pretty much pacifists, that thought that, you know, to kill anybody that isn't a threat to us, you know, it doesn't make any sense. So I mean, that was just my observation, and then even thinking back on it now, that's pretty much the conflict that we had when we were in the military.
Okay.
Do you think the veterans from the Vietnam War have enough support?
I think it's much better today than it was even 5 or 10 years ago. One of the things that one of the problems with the Vietnam War, they didn't even call it a war until recently. It was really what they called it was a conflict. And I won't go into why they did that. But a little bit of it is that, you know, that could it possibly be that because if you were not in a war situation, a lot of the help that you could get if you were a veteran of a war wouldn't apply to you. So you couldn't get those helps. But I see from my son Fred coming back from Afghanistan and going to the VA for him because of injuries and so forth that he had suffered. I had seen a number of Vietnam veterans that were there now that finally are starting to get the care for Agent Orange, for all kinds of horrible things that were experimented on really with the Vietnamese and the Cambodians to combat that war that, you know, come to find out about it, it had been fought for 20 years by the French, by their elite forces, the Foreign Legion, and they got nowhere. And I think, you know, we came in there thinking we're going to just turn this thing around in a week and we're going to get out of there, but it lasted and it dragged on and on and on. And some people compare today's conflict with ISIS and with the Taliban and with insurgents with back then, and it's totally different today. Because today we do have a real enemy that's attacked us on our soil, and we can see it. You know, we've experienced it. Back then, we just had hearsay that this was going to destroy our country, and so you know, it was all. But anyways, that's go on.
Right. So you mentioned that America is facing sort of a similar conflict today with the Islamic State. Mm-hmm. So how do you think that the Vietnam War changed the American perspective on foreign intervention?
I think what it, and once again, we started back up again?
Yeah.
Sorry guys.
Okay.
But it's, you know, that's a long process really to explain because things began to change immediately with just the intervention of the end of the war, and it was a forced end. And plus we had a lot of our national leaders, our president, I think John F. Kennedy was assassinated, our president, and then Robert Kennedy, I think he was the Secretary of State, or he was assassinated. The Civil Rights Movement was in full swing, and Martin Luther King was assassinated. So it was a very, I mean, really, when you look at it in history, it was a very strange time in our country that we had never seen before. And I think just to comment on that a little bit at the beginning, the Vietnam War and those events took away the innocence of America, so that we believed everything that the government told us up to that point. We believed everything about foreign policy and what other countries were doing and how good or bad they were in how they dealt with their own people within themselves or with us. And so we believed it 100%. When that started happening, there became almost a fear entered into the country where it wasn't so much we didn't know who to trust, it was more we didn't know what was going to come next. And we didn't think it was going to be good. And we became a lot more cynical and a lot more critical. And I believe that's really the birth of the free press to come out and have freedom of speech and speak what was on their minds and so forth. Up to that point, if you had a protest against the war, it was really frowned upon. I mean, and even when the men would come back and women from Vietnam, when their tours were over, they didn't get the hurrahs and they didn't get any respect whatsoever. You know, one of the things I love to do now when I work at the cruise line is if I see someone come through with a military ID, you know, it's just, to me, it's great to be able to just a simple little thing like thank you for your service, you know. Nothing like that happened back then. So it was an unthankful thing. You were almost looked down upon because you were in the military. And I think what that's changed over the country is we've become more aware of what's involved because of the press, because of exposure to foreign events and it on the internet and in the news and so forth over there, TV and radio, that now we understand a little bit more of what's going on, and we understand the seriousness of certain things. And so that's how I think that it's kind of changed. And I think it's because that secretivism that we had and that innocence has been done away with, which is a shame in a way, but it had to come to the point where when the enemy started striking us from within, we are a little more sensitive to it and less naive than we used to be. So.
How would America be different if we hadn't entered the war?
Okay. Boy, I don't have a crystal ball. I mean, that's very hard to, because I think we would have still evolved, if that's a good word, into with the communications that are worldwide now. I mean, no, you can't do anything now. I mean, if an event happens on the street, usually somebody will video it on their phone. So it's very hard to do anything that is covert or or behind the scenes without people finding out about it. So I think that in itself would have changed things. The Vietnam War, if it did anything, was got a lot of refugees over here. There'd be a lot less demand on the VA system for people that need help now because of injuries and mental and physical. I think if we hadn't gone into that war, it would have taken us a lot longer to be able for the psychiatric community to diagnose some of the mental illnesses that have come out of severe combat or trauma, post-traumatic stress. Up until really just a few months ago, it was even really recognized as a real legitimate diagnosis for VA help. So I think that might have speeded up some of the help that the troops get now. But some people will say there was no good in the Vietnam War, and I'm sure they can prove that point. And others will say it was a time when they grew up. I mean, a lot of us went into the military very, very idealistic and very immature in ways of how the world did things. And part of that was because as baby boomers, we came out of a booming economy. World War II was over. It was the time that the government stepped in and helped the GIs when they came back with housing. Families were growing. Things were good. You could see old TV series back then that, guys all dressed in suits and women stayed at home with a little apron on and cooked and cleaned the house and everybody was happy and that was kind of guys came home from work and had cocktails waiting for them. Everybody was drinking martinis and becoming alcoholics and but it was a different time. So we were very idealistic and we were very opinionated in the standpoint at first that the space races going on, we're the greatest country in the world. We were, if we got any media at all at that time, it was to tell us that we needed to be patriotic and we needed to defend the world against communism, and it's going to just ruin the whole society of everyone, so of every nation, and we need to eradicate that. Well, Vietnam kind of brought that to a head so that people took a harder look at that whole stand. Some good might have come out of it, but probably mostly bad, in my opinion.
All right. Well, I think we can wrap it up. Thank
All
you
right.
so much for your time.
You're so welcome, you too. And you, Jay. No, yeah. All right.